Hello, my name is Maria Titizian, and welcome to this episode of Examining the Context. Today, we're diving into the critical topic of early warning systems and their role in Armenia's national security. My guest, as always, is Dr. Nerses Kopalyan, author of our monthly EVN Security Report. Welcome to the program, Nerses.
Great to be here.
February's briefing is titled Early Warning Systems Anticipating Threats and Preparing for Attacks. It examines how Armenia can develop a proactive security strategy amid a complex and evolving threat landscape. With rising regional tensions and ongoing hybrid threats, having a structured, intelligence, and data-driven early warning system is no longer a luxury, but a necessity. Nerses, in your article, you outline a four-front threat matrix that Armenia faces. I want to talk about this before we jump into by what we mean by early warning systems. Let's talk about this threat matrix. How does this shape the urgency of developing an effective early warning system? And also, what are some of the mitigation models?
Generally speaking, most developed countries or those with developed militaries and security systems do have early warning systems. But of course, the one that's utilized by the Western states tend to be the most evolved ones. Specifically, when we look at small states that face certain risks or bigger neighbors, their early warning systems tend to be relatively not only better evolved, but also designed to be commensurate with their small state or comprehensive security approaches. So Israel, for example, has one of the most advanced ones. No surprise there. The Nordic countries have quite advanced early warning systems. Sweden is excellent at this. The Finns have had one. The Estonians have developed a very robust one as well. And so they understand that this is part of the security architecture. Early warning and information collection and being able to anticipate or observe developments and therefore be prepared for it are crucial. And so what we're understanding is that you may be extremely strong, hypothetically speaking, but a reactive strategic approach doesn't always work. Now, a reactive strategic approach for small states can be detrimental. A reactive strategic approach for a small state that has limited capabilities can be deadly. So within the confluence of those sort of structural thinking, we see that Armenia's situation fits within the criteria of a small state with an underdeveloped security architecture that faces immense threats. And this is why a small state security doctrine that is based on a proactive early warning system, as you noted, isn't a preference, but a fundamental necessity for Armenia. Now, of course, to understand what a early warning system needs to constitute, we need to understand the dangers that a given country faces in order to develop a warning system commensurate with those dangers and threats. And Armenia's threat matrix is primarily defined by four major domains. And each domain presents in itself a level of a threat as well. The first one is the most obvious one, right? It is the direct security, physical security threat that is posed against Armenia by Azerbaijan. And so this generally has taken the expansive resources, almost the entirety of the resources that the Armenian state has to address and mitigate. Armenia has developed some early warning capabilities, some proactive strategies with respect to this, but it's not at the level, the advanced level necessary. Nonetheless, this is the first threat. The second threat, which we qualify in the literature and the scholarship within the domain of long-term strategic considerations. These are what we can call generally the neo-imperial threats posed by Russia and in various instances of Turkey. Now, these are, of course, 5 to 10 or 15-year trajectories. These are not immediate. But nonetheless, early warning systems aren't simply about what's going to happen next month, this week, or in a couple of months. Early warning systems also must address long-term trajectories and therefore have the strategic ability of mitigating that. In that context, the second domain is specific to the long-term threats that will be presented by neo-imperial interests. And in our region, that's primarily Moscow and Ankara. Now, this may change hypothetically to other actors, but the model says you need to have something that addresses long-term threats. The third threat is in the domain of continuity, and is the continued and amplified hybrid warfare tactics that are utilized by Azerbaijan against Armenia, and the intermittent ones that we consistently see coming from Russia as well. So dehybridization and mitigating the hybrid threat also falls into a threat matrix. The fourth level is very unique and original to the Armenian situation, and this is the disinformation campaign that is unleashed against the Republic of Armenia, specifically Armenia's democratic consolidation, democratic culture, and democratic transition. What is unique about this is that the disinformation campaign within this domain, and this is separate from the hybrid attacks that you see from Russia and Azerbaijan. The disinformation campaign here is actually instituted and implemented by Armenia's illiberal or non-democratic opposition forces. And with them, the wing of the illiberal forces in the diaspora that also oppose democratic Armenia, and they participate in proliferating the disinformation campaign throughout the Armenian nation. So pretty much what you have in Armenia, the same talking points, the same attacks, the same disinformation with respect to the government, the political developments, etc. These same talking points are basically copied and amplified by certain diasporan circles. And these mostly tend to be ARF affiliated organizations. So there's a coordinated attack, a disinformation campaign against the Republic of Armenia or Armenia's democratic institutions by actors within the Armenian domain. And this is where it remains somewhat unique. Of course, this is the more minimal threat, but nonetheless, disinformation campaigns tend to be problems and weaponized tools in of themselves. And so they fall within the threat matrix. So Armenia generally faces these four threat areas. And to mitigate these, what we have seen Armenia do in the last 2 years demonstrate promising steps, but it is not the same as having a evolved, developed, highly systematized early warning systems. To address these threat matrix, these threats within the matrix that we noted, Armenia has basically utilized a two-tiered mitigation model, and some has been through trial and error, but several of them have been part of a well-established contingency plan that I can speak of. So with respect, for example, long-term threats or the direct threats by Azerbaijan, Armenia has relied on diplomatization of security. This is a concept that we coined at the security report here at EVN. And what we've seen is that it has been a proactive measure that has had an important positive effect. Of course, it's not sufficient, but it is a mitigating mechanism. And the second one, with respect to the immediate and long-term threat, has been enhancing deterrence capabilities, and this is the immense spending that Armenia has been doing. So we could see these are diplomatic and hard power-related approaches. They're important, but they in of themselves aren't evolved early warning systems. These are just proactive measures that attempt to mitigate some of the threats in the matrix. The second mitigation model that Armenia has used is the development of dehybridization and resiliency modeling. And we've been talking about this for the last 2 years. It's nascent, it's new, but it is being utilized and it is being implemented. The fact that Armenia has developed a comprehensive security model, and right now it's in the process of implementation between the whole governmental departments that have been produced, all the discourse that is going on, the whole of society and whole of government approaches. These are examples of how Armenia is going to be mitigating some of the threats with respect to disinformation, to hybrid attacks, and enhancing resiliency capabilities. So as we see, there have been initial, basic foundational steps that Armenia has taken to mitigate these threats. The modeling that I talk about in the security report, and which will eventually be part of Armenia's early warning system, is something that comes from the international intelligence community, or what we qualify as intelligence studies. So EVN introduced much of the discourse in Armenia on security studies. What this article does, what this piece does, it introduces intelligence studies into the Armenian discourse, because we all understand we need to be able to forecast, predict, and be prepared. These are the terms that we use, but we don't speak in the language of early warning systems because intelligence studies in Armenia has never existed. So for first to understand the modality of threats that the country faces, next is to develop a threat matrix, and then to utilize the expansive modeling that's out there with respect to developing early warning systems. And so much of the article addresses and explains what this will look like for Armenia.
You mentioned obviously, that Armenia's past approach to security has been largely reactive, and now that we need some key structural or policy changes in order to transition to a more proactive model, right? And this is through, as you said, the developing the national security strategy and the adaptation of a small state comprehensive security doctrine. Now, coming back to intelligence services, you mentioned, and I want to briefly touch upon these, the 6 key errors in risk assessment that contribute to flawed strategic choices. And this obviously emphasizes the urgent need for a robust early warning system. Can we just go through those very quickly?
Of course. What I did is I borrowed the content from the broader literature in intelligence studies. And, in the literature, there are basically 6 general set of errors that are inherent to erroneous or incomplete information that decision makers get. And what this does is not only does it throw off completely any early warning considerations or ability to properly prepare, it also disrupts the ability to confront. And so what happens is you end up being reactive. In the case of a country like Armenia that does not have the capabilities, right, that faces stronger neighbors, a reactive strategic approach can be catastrophic, and we have seen this. And so that is kind of the broader framework that informs why these 6 precepts, errors that are in the literature become so important for Armenia. The first one that we see in intelligence studies that addresses this is the lack of sufficient data and relevant information on which decisions can be based. And this was very, very clear in both 2016 and also in the 2020 war, right? A lack of sufficient data information was a big problem. Armenia, a lot of times, had no idea what Azerbaijan was doing, what their capabilities were. And in that context, this clearly diminishes even the most minimal reactive or early warning capabilities. The second error is the incapacity or sort of a general inability to process and recognize the systemic and the interconnected relationship between whatever data you may have and whatever data that's been collected. In Armenia, there's always been a disconnect between, for example, what the military intelligence might collect, what the NSS might have. How is this coded? How is this systematized? What methodology is used, right? It's a lot of times, this is not a surprise to anybody, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. Within the domain of intelligence and early warnings, these can be deadly. And decision makers will be getting incorrect information, whether it's at the tactical level, whether it's at the military level, or whether it's at the political level with the leadership, right? So this is why these things are quite complex, but also problematic. The third area is sort of an inability to distinguish between what we call operationalizable data and marginally irrelevant information. Again, this was fundamentally problematic both from 2016, from 2016 all the way to 2020, but also into 2022 with the German invasions, right? Armenia's security apparatus or intelligence force or intelligence capabilities were completely clueless when Azeri forces simply marched into Sevlich, into Black Lake, and started just randomly, casually occupying space and territories, right? Because what we knew at that operationalizable level, the threats that were to, for example, certain sectors of the borders or certain sectors of the villages were disconnected from what the enemy was operating off of. So you've had a lot of these disconnect between the formalities of operationalizable data. And the fourth one is a problem for a lot of countries, but for Armenia, and I'll say until the 2020 German invasion and subsequently after that, the fourth error is a serious problem. And this is sort of the problem of bureaucratization, organizational defects, and sort of the institutional negligence that we see at the systemic level when it comes to processing collected data, utilizing this information, and not being able to transition this information into intelligence. Armenia is able to, for example, like any state, the bureaucracies of the Armenian state at different levels are able to absorb quite a bit of information, whatever this may be. This isn't properly transitioned into intelligence and then operationalizable intelligence. And so bureaucratic shortcoming, institutional negligence, and organizational defects contribute to this. Now, the United States had some of this prior to 9/11, for example. Europeans have had this when they had the Al Qaeda attacks and ISIS attacks happening, so on and so forth. This is not a perfect process, right? This is where a lot of countries struggle with terrorist activities because the confluence of interinstitutional defects do not allow for a full-scale operationalization of the data. For Armenia, it's on a whole different level because this isn't simply operations or lone wolf attacks. This is a neighbor undertaking huge operations against you, and the left hand of one bureaucracy doesn't know what the right hand of the other institution is doing. So this is kind of what we're talking about. The fifth one's been a chronic problem for Armenia, specifically after the Velvet Revolution. And this is the distrust of the decision makers in the quality and capabilities of the institutions that we have, which are responsible for the collection, processing, and the operationalization of the data and information ascertained. And we can understand this is the case because we've known for a long time, and this was very, very clear with what Germany went through with East Germany's Stasi being dismantled and incorporated into Western Germany, what the East European states went through. When you don't have lustration, when you don't have institutions, specifically within the security apparatus, that have been cleansed of insulated pockets that have had and continue to have influence from external actors, and in our case, Russia, because Russia basically built, trained, and developed everybody within these institutions, decision makers tend to have distrust with the quality of content that's coming out. And this has proven to be consistently true because the quality of information and the capabilities of these institutions to predict or engage in early warning has been abysmal. And this isn't on the individuals that work within these institutions, right? They simply do not have the training and the capability, but more so the way they operate and the reliance on the northern neighbor has always been a problem. And we've talked about this for a long time. This is not a secret or anything like that, right? A vast majority of our intelligence officers, if we can call them that, go through 5 years of training in Russia. This is a problem. Because it's a fundamental problem. And so in that context, you do have concerns where you might have highly professionalized individuals, but then you might have individuals who are not as professionalized, and their training really creates problems for institutional cohesion. So the fifth aspect is very, very important to consider. And note that most countries that have advanced early warning systems, right, their intelligence training is either in-house or with allies that share the same interests and values. As we've seen, this is not the case with Armenia and Russia, and therefore it poses the problem that it does. And the sixth one is obviously follows up on all the previous ones we discussed, and this is where when decisions are made or are made by leadership, and they come off of limited, incorrect, or flawed data, and this produces a lot of misinterpretation. And a very concrete example that we have here was the situation with Shushi during the 2020 war. It was just consistent incoherence. The military was getting one set of information. The Artsakh army was getting another set of information. The political leadership was getting something else. The MFA was getting something else. Was Shushi lost? Had it been partially preoccupied? On what basis was the counterattack organized? Why did the counterattack fail? It was just collective incoherence. And I'm not going to proceed and say it was this general's fault or that person's. That's not what we're doing. What we're doing is we're observing and we're seeing how these factors can produce a disaster. Now, you amplify this one example at the macro level, at the broader security level for the entirety of the state, then you see the kind of problems that could come out. So intelligence studies does provide us sort of this very robust set of empirical and case study based information that we can utilize to learn from engaging best practices and alleviate these errors that have been so prevalent in Armenian security architecture for the last 30 years.
Fascinating stuff, Nerses. We have military intelligence, yes? And like you said, they were mostly trained in Russia. The Armenian government established a foreign intelligence service today. Prior to the establishment of the FIS, where was Armenia getting its intelligence from? From the military only, or was it through the National Security Service? Who was responsible for intelligence, or did we even have? Obviously, we didn't, but how is this even possible?
What we had is borderline window shopping, to be quite honest, because we do have, for example, a department within the general staff of the armed forces that deals with intelligence. You have a department. You don't have an entire military intelligence institution or a structure within the military that deals with institutions. You have a department within a structure that demonstrates the sort of the limitations and a lack of scope of military intelligence. And yes, everybody in Armenian military intelligence is Russian trained, which again limits their capabilities. But Armenia has never relied on military intelligence for national intelligence or early warning capabilities. Military intelligence in Armenia is primarily operated off of the basis of ascertaining specific tactical intelligence that could be utilized at the specific level by military planners. So it hasn't been utilized at the level of national security or developing a national deterrence capacity. So it's been a very specific, localized capability. And this is in of itself problematic because if you look at the military intelligence of developed countries or developed militaries that have advanced security architectures, military intelligence is a very big part of it. In Armenia, it is not the case. So the bulk of intelligence and being able to ascertain and process information and data that could be fed into some level of proactive or early warning behavior has fallen on the shoulders of the National Security Service, the NSS. And the problem with this, of course, is that all the tools that the NSS has, all the resources and the capabilities that they have, is not only limited, it's fundamentally Russia reliant, meaning all of its officers were trained in Russia, and more so, it would rely on the information that the Russians would share. So the source of intelligence that you need to address your security problems are reliant on an external actor. And an external actor, for very rational reasons, is only going to share information that is commensurate with their interests and not specifically yours. And that fundamentally puts Armenia's or has put Armenia's National Security Service at a disadvantage. More so at the structural level, in all developed security systems, right? In all developed in countries that have developed security systems, domestic intelligence and counterintelligence and law enforcement is separated from their foreign capabilities, from foreign intelligence, right? The US, you have the CIA and the FBI, right? For example, in the UK, you have the MI6 externally and the 5 internally, so on and so forth. The French have the domestic services and the GSF for the external services, so on and so forth. In Armenia, it's merged, where the NSS had to both investigate a murder and deal with external intelligence collection. It's dysfunctional. It's the KGB model, right? It's a legacy of Soviet institutions. And so the confluence of all of this has clearly created deficiencies in our ability to mitigate the 6 errors that I noted, and at the same time develop a very developed or enhanced early warning systems. And so what the FIS, the Foreign Intelligence Service, the new one that was developed about a year and a half ago, or almost 2 years ago, my dates might be off, becomes a structural a game changer for Armenia, meaning now we have an institution that is designed to precisely gather information, processes, and then produce operationalized intelligence. Sure, it doesn't do field work like espionage and things like that. That's not what we're talking about. But at least we have an institution that can engage in the process of ascertaining data and feeding it into the early warning system.
This makes me think, is there not a conflict today between the NSS and the FIS?
Not necessarily, because what we have seen is the NSS understands that the amount of institutional burden and responsibility that fall on its shoulders are really incommensurate with its capabilities, right? So NSS, for example, deals with crime. NSS deals with domestic issues of instability, and the NSS deals with counterintelligence, which is a domestic phenomenon, right? All of those things are more than enough for the NSS to address. To require the NSS to also have a foreign component fundamentally creates institutional overstretch and it overburdens the institution itself. So I don't think there's an institutional conflict because traditionally NSS has not really dealt with foreign intelligence. It has primarily relied on Russia to give us whatever they give us. So, lacking the tool set and the skill set because of the mandate that they had, the FIS serves a different thing, initiative. Also, we have to be very honest about this. Until the Velvet Revolution, NSS's responsibility was not foreign intelligence. It was basically to maintain the regime in power, whether it was a Sarkisian regime or the Kochayan regime, right? So it was a domestic Praetorian Guard as opposed to a highly developed foreign intelligence service. So the FIS's responsibility is categorically different than what the NSS as an institution has practiced. It's not what they were supposed to do on paper. It could be on paper that's what they were supposed to do, but they've never really done that. So, in this context, I don't think there's an interinstitutional conflict. More so, it creates the basis for a healthier cohesion because the FIS becomes now an important tool that could address a lot of the shortcomings. And the two could supplement and feed each other as opposed to having some kind of a conflict or tensions.
So, okay, we understand the landscape, we understand the shortcomings. Still mind-boggling that after 2016, we didn't figure out that we needed to have a early warning system. And now we have the FIS, we have the NSS. In very plain terms, what would the structure of an early warning system look like for Armenia?
Well, to very quickly answer your question and to explain the primitive nature of thinking that we had in Armenia, our early warning system after the 2016 4-day war was basically to place cameras in the border areas and to put cameras basically in the line of contact. That's what we qualified as an early warning system. And for most advanced, security systems, it's kind of laughable, right? But that was the thinking. They thought that would suffice. And this is, again, and I'm being anecdotal, but if you don't have an intelligence studies school, if you don't have your own intelligence capabilities, you're kind of engaging in trial and error ad hoc. And this is why we did the sort of, weird and awkward things that we did after 2016. But to answer your question, indeed, there's quite a bit of advanced modeling that we see that Armenia will be adapting, will be developing, that shows it has worked exceptionally well. In the report for this month, right, I basically borrowed the model that was used by the Ukrainians, which was developed with the help of its Western partners, in being able to very successfully preempt a lot of the operational and the tactical objectives of the Russians. Never mind the fact that Russian symmetrical the power disparity was on a whole different level, right? So even with the whole asymmetrical gap, right, the data collection and data processing and the intelligence conversion model that the Ukrainians used proved to be highly, highly effective. And so this is something that Armenia will be integrating into its information processing mechanisms. But overarchingly, right, when we look at early warning systems, there are a few models. The most advanced one is the integrated crisis early warning system that the United States has. And this entails a lot of advanced AI stuff, a lot of advanced mathematical techniques, an immense amount of resources, right? The US Defense Advanced Research Agency basically deals with this. And this is a multi-billion-dollar endeavor. Now, of course, Armenia is not going to engage in that, but the modeling is very, very successful. And so in this context, right, when we're talking about early warning, predictive modeling, forecast modeling, processing the data and the information to have probability of assessment, this is what the FIS will be doing, right? Using statistical modeling, forecast data modeling, and all these things to produce outputs. And based on that, we could start triangulating situations at the strategic level and being able to anticipate threats and be prepared for them. And so an important part of this broader modeling is to understand that there are three levels, three different types of early system warnings or early warnings that make up the broader system. The first one is what we call in intelligence studies in the literature, strategic early warnings. And strategic early warnings primarily deals with sort of this a very comprehensive understanding of the threats that are posed by the opponents that a country has, the strategic state of affairs that define the circumstances, and then processing the information based on these specific threats, shifts, changes in behavioral patterns, or fluctuations in risk propensity that the opponents or the enemy's activities produce. So strategic early warning, right, tries to connect tangible developments with sort of the conceptual basis of your security doctrine, of your deterrence capabilities, so on and so forth. So we think of strategic early warning as having the macro contours of a system that is strategically positioned and has the contingency plans and the tools and the capabilities and the understanding that if X, Y, and Z happen, early trigger warnings are put out, you move accordingly, right? So it's at the macro level. And of course, strategic early warning also is designed to address long-term threats, right? If there are shifts in Russia's or Turkey's behavior on X, Y, and Z issues in the next 3 years, 5 years, or 7 years, what does this indicate, and how should Armenia position proactively to eventually mitigate? If there are continuous shifts, you adapt, so on and so forth, right? So this is what we're talking about at the strategic level. With respect to the operational early warning level, this is a more specific, right? Operational early warning is designed to allow the given security apparatus of a state to engage in what we call operational art and operational planning. Simply put, this is where you implement and you operationalize all of the pertinent early warning intelligence. So you have that stuff at the strategic level, you have the contingency plans and all the things as I noted. At the operational level, right, you develop plans and strategic initiatives that would allow you to very quickly implement and operationalize should early warning triggers be signaled. So in this context, right, the way this would work is if strategic planning is going to be done by the FIS, and the output will go to the National Security Council, which will then go to the PM's office, and everybody will receive it, right, understanding all the nuances that are involved. The operational level, right, is more specific. Okay, at the operational level, for example, you have, let's say, a level of strategic early warning that says in a 7 to 8 month window or in a 5 to 10 month window, Azerbaijan is going to carry out operations in X, Y, and Z areas. Okay, it's not really imminent, but the trajectory is there. At the operational level, you will start putting together plans, right, to implement and mitigate should Azerbaijan within a time period carry out X, Y, and Z. So what the operational level does is it creates the tools and the capabilities to implement the strategic output as you get the intelligence and as you engage in proactive demeanor. This level, the operational level, is basically going to be dominated by the NSS with a lot of input from the FIS. And the third one is the tactical early warning framework, and this refers specifically to physical and tangible threats. So Armenians generally have understood early warning primarily through the tactical lens, right? We overheard the Azeri saying something. We were able to intercept some conversations. We were able to basically engage in reconnaissance, go behind enemy lines, observe movements. Therefore, they're going to be hitting these targets. And based on that, you immediately develop tactical solutions to be prepared. That's obviously one small part of it. As the extensive conversation we're having, early warnings is much broader and multifaceted. But a tactical early warning is one part of it. And this, as I noted, right, it deals with the physical and the tangible matters that are specific to time and space. And this primarily deals with the NSS and in specific cases, the military. Tactical early warnings are usually used for domestic stability reasons, right? So for example, if there's a threat of a terrorist attack, if there's a threat of domestic violence issues, right? Then this falls within the purview of the NSS because they have the strategic warning structure. They already have operationalized plans. At the tactical level, once the concrete early warning information comes in, then they physically address it. Or with respect to the military, right? We have both at the strategic level and the operational level enough information, knowledge, design, contingency, and operational capability to address a potential attack on a village or a potential incursion in a specific area. And this is where the tactical early warning is implemented because that's where the special forces will be utilized. That's where drone attacks will be coordinated to preempt, so on and so forth, right? So we think of tactical at the level where basically physical capabilities are utilized. And so early warning systems, as we see, right, proceeds from the strategic level, which requires a lot of information, a lot of processing, and a lot of operationalizable intelligence. Then this goes to the operational level, where operational art produces the mechanisms of implementing should the X, Y, and Z triggers be put into effect. And the tactical is developing all the capabilities, right? So that when the early warnings creep in, right, the tactical is physically implemented.
There has been decades and decades of research and scholarship on this and actual operationalization of all of this. Is this, I mean, we can't say it's an exact science, but it has been tested and it can be implemented within our own state structures. That's an assumption on my part. But my next question to you is, and perhaps this isn't a fair question, but do we even have the resources, the capability, the human resources to be able to adopt or um, implement some of these very technical systems within our own systems, if you will?
Well, initially we didn't, and this is why the FIS was created, right?
Right, but you can create a FIS, but
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. But this is the whole point, right? You create an institution and you train it and develop it and design it in a way that is supposed to meet these responsibilities. Is it a precise art? No, it's not. Does it enhance your capabilities compared to what you had in the past? Of course it does. Does it solve all your problems? Of course it does. And if it did, you'd be a developed country and most powerful actor in the region. Okay, but when we're talking about capability, a few things are very important to note here. The FIS was developed precisely on the type of models we discussed of countries that have had successful security architectures, which mostly includes the NATO countries and small states that have been able to develop advanced early system warnings and information processing capabilities. That's one. Two, much of the training, this is not a secret, right? Much of the training for the FIS, best practices, knowledge, etc., right, is borrowed from the successful and well-established training models that come from these countries. So in that context, clearly the capacity building process is based on successful models. Whether this is going to be completely successful or not, that's not what we're talking about here, because success obviously is relative and it's a building process, as we noted. But what we can talk about here is that, to answer your question, whereas in the past, early warning systems were not even part of the conversation, the logic would not even have made sense. Your institutions, even if you wanted to, weren't designed to absorb and basically operationalize this. Now you are developing institutions that can utilize this modeling to address your problems. Needless to say, this is going to take time, but at least you are providing the foundations in which you can develop early warnings. And so in that context, compared to when 2016, when you had nothing, compared to 2020, when you had a lot of misinformation, right? We're walking to 2025 with an understanding that we could learn from our mistakes, we could use best practices, and we could develop a model that, of course, isn't going to solve all of our predictive problems, but at least it gives us tools where we did not have in the past.
Right. And at the end of the day, it's about eliminating uncertainty, which, was the overarching issue.
Absolutely, and one of the not to speak too much as a social scientist or a political scientist, but probably modeling is fundamentally important in addressing uncertainty. You don't fully mitigate it, but if the FIS, for example, right now, based on such modeling, is able to inform the Prime Minister, the National Security Council, the military, that there's a 73% probability of this, or within this situation, there's a 55% probability of that, or an 80% probability of that. Now you have quantifiable, tangible information that you can make decisions and strategy over, as opposed to the previous model, right? If you want to call it that, where it's basically one of assumption, creative construction of ideas that could possibly become an outcome, or generally a sense of self-righteous hubris that was determining decision making, because person X has been in this institution for 30 years, and his gut
Therefore,
feeling, their
Mhm.
gut feeling defines policy and things of that sort, right? So what we're talking about here, we are bringing science, okay? We are bringing artificial intelligence. We're bringing machine learning. We are bringing things that have never been part of Armenia's security thinking into developing capabilities that give us early warnings. And so, to answer your question, that in of itself is capacity building, where in the past you did not have.
We always like to end on a hopeful note, but you started with small state comprehensive security and looking at other small states and how they have utilized early warning systems. And you mentioned Ukraine. We always like to talk about current events. Can we talk about Zelensky and Trump and what actually happened and what that was all about? Was it a spectacle? Was it showmanship? Was there some underlying, I don't know, theater happening? But it was certainly the topic of conversation across the world.
Most definitely. So there are three schools of thought on this.
Okay,
Yeah, which is very interesting.
already. Okay.
One school of thought is the European school that's kind of led by the incoming German Chancellor Merz, who basically said this was a sabotage operation designed by Trump and Vance to humiliate and obviously think break Zelensky. And there are, of course, certain political parties and factions in the United States who subscribe to that. That's one school of thought. The second school of thought says that this was kind of spontaneous because, the room next door was prepared, the mineral agreement was going to be signed. Clearly, if this was a sabotage activity, why would it have gone through all that work? Also, this was all embarrassing for the White Office, the president as well. Nobody wanted this, so this was sadly a spontaneous, unanticipated development, with Zelensky being at fault for upsetting the president. Nonetheless, it happened. So that's one school of thought. And then there's a third school of thought. The third school of thought says that Zelensky very cleverly um, initiated this sort of ruckus to both expose Trump's hidden and latent pro-Russianness and thus mobilize European
Europe.
support for Ukraine under the understanding that if any of you have hope or you're hoping against hope that the Trump administration is eventually going to step up against Russia and behave in the same way that the Biden administration has, forget about it. And so this spectacle was designed by Zelensky or instigated by Zelensky to expose the White House for what it is from their lens and therefore mobilize and unify Europe. So these are the sort of the three general schools of thought that proceed. I don't subscribe to either of those. What I think is, and I'm kind of triangulating the content here as an international securities scholar. What we have here is that there was obviously latent animosity between the two sides. Trump has been upset with Zelensky going back to 2018, 2019, when Zelensky refused to undertake an investigation against Biden and his son. So for Trump, there are personal elements here that this current ruckus did not expose. Two, the Trump administration does genuinely believe that Zelensky wants to basically exploit and keep using American weapons and American capabilities to continue the war. Trump refuses to accept the fact that Putin is going to violate any ceasefire and that Putin is not a reliable security partner. In this content, Trump's argument is that you have this little, chihuahua of a Zelensky yelling, barking, right, demanding things, but I'm the main decision maker. You're dependent on me, right? You don't get to dictate terms to me. And so that structure of narrative engagement was in of itself a recipe to basically to explode. So the situation itself was combustible, and all was necessary was a Zelensky question and a Vance sarcastic response that exploded the whole thing. So I look at things at the structural level, and what I'm saying is that the structure of the relationship, the divergence of issues, and basically very little agreement on matters, plus the clash of personalities, created the right formula, the right recipe for this thing to blow up. Now, of course, the embarrassing way that it blew up, and I don't think the Trump administration wanted this as well, but the embarrassing way that this blew up was counterproductive for both. But of course, both are basically are digging their heels in, right? Trump is taking a position that he is, and Zelensky is refusing to apologize, and he's galvanizing the Europeans. But so to answer your question, I don't think this was orchestrated. This was not some dance, and I think it hurt both interests. Of course, now you're at a position where these sort of clashing or diverging views can be mitigated. But for Trump, this becomes, he sees this as an important instrument that he could further use against Zelensky. And for Zelensky, he's going to try to mitigate the anger of the White House while at the same time fully mobilizing Europe. And the two outcomes are very, very interesting, right? Trump declared that the United States would be pausing assistance to Europe. What does this mean? That means, to Ukraine. Well, Ukraine has another 4 to 6 months of American weaponry that it could utilize. After that, if the pause sustains itself, Ukraine is going to be in somewhat of a trouble, at least at the operational level. But the other side is that Europe just announced an 800 billion investment into its security, 150 billion of that allocated to Ukraine. And understanding that they have a 6-month window, right? The speed at which they move is going to determine this. But at the end of the day, what we're seeing is Europe slowly becoming a center of hard power, whereas in the past it was purely a soft power. And the United States, the very center of the transatlantic hard power structure, is basically taking a back step from that. If the Europeans, and this if isn't a very big if because Europeans have finally woken up, if the Europeans are able to address this pause from US assistance in a relatively quick manner, right? Trump's bluff or Trump's gamble isn't going to work. If the Europeans are not able to do that, and Ukraine faces severe shortages on the battlefront and has basically tactical losses and retreats in the battlefield, then Trump's bluff would have worked. But fundamentally, Trump's point is basically you need to conform and acquiesce to what I'm putting on the table, and that is peace on my terms.
Right.
Europeans are saying, dude, the kind of peace that you're proposing is kind of, favoring the Russians. And Trump's point is like, for me, peace is beneficial to the United States. That's how I'm looking at it. After that, I don't care who it benefits. The White House in of itself is not incorrect from this lens. But from the broader lens of America's security architecture, this is fundamentally problematic because the United States is diminishing its influence as a hegemon. Meaning, if the Europeans, right, for the last 70 years have been reliant on Americans, which means America has had very important levers of influence on Europe, that those levers are going to be diminished if European dependence on the United States is no longer there. And I could tell you the French are very happy about this. And the British are quite confused because having left the European Union because of the buffoons that led Brexit, what you have here is those people now regretting. And so you have Boris Johnson, who left Brexit, now saying Trump is wrong and Ukraine is correct. Well, why did I sarcastically qualify them as buffoons? Because now they are left out of the European security architecture. And this puts Britain in a very difficult place. They can't be part of the European security architecture, okay, at least formally. But at the same time, they cannot antagonize the Trump administration because they're important partners. If UK was part of the EU, they would have more flexibility in being critical of Trump. But now UK, the most anti-Russian country in Europe, has to tone down its rhetoric lest it upset its older brother. And so this is why its configuration is
Or its younger brother, Nerses.
Okay, let's say bigger brother, younger brother. Sure, yeah, that's
This is
the
probably the longest
Canadian must, the Commonwealth must speak.
This is probably the longest podcast we've done, but I have a couple of more quick questions or comments. Let me put it this way. So right after that whole ruckus in the Oval Office, Armenia's, I don't know how to call them, expert community, or we're experts on everything from pandemics to security, even though we might not be. But the conversations or the chatter was that the transatlantic alliance is collapsing Do you see how inopportune or what an error it was on behalf of Armenia's authorities to, try to decouple from Russia? The whole world is falling apart. So there was a level of hysteria that was quite interesting. That's one observation. The other is you gave an interview last week right after the conversation, if that's what we can call it, between Zelensky and Trump. And you mentioned something that was really interesting to me, that and you mentioned it again, that Europe will now have to take responsibility for hard power. And what does this mean for Armenia? With Armenia now diversifying its bilateral relations with different EU member states, can this be beneficial for Armenia?
So to answer your first question, the problem with these so-called expert community in Armenia, at least big chunks of them, is that they're not sufficiently trained in international relations and international security, because you don't have that school in Armenia. So most of their education is basically on punditry, and they utilize basic talking points without understanding the depth of developments. No, the transatlantic security architecture is not collapsing. It is reconfiguring and is changing. Trump cannot collapse the transatlantic security architecture. What he could do is he could basically make the United States relatively inactive, but he cannot collapse it. And once the Trump administration is gone, regardless of what Republican wins, if Republicans win, the dynamics are going to be very, very different. I can tell you that there are people in the Trump team and in the entire Republican leadership, they're afraid to talk about it, but none of them are happy about what's going on, because the United States and its entire resources, capabilities, and economic might are intertwined with the security architecture that the transatlantic alliance forms. So that's one aspect that I don't know if the so-called experts in Armenia understand or don't understand. But spewing crummy talking points doesn't really make one an expert. Further, Armenia's decoupling from Russia has nothing to do with the Trump administration's demeanor towards Ukraine. Armenia did not say, you know what, excuse my language, we're giving the middle finger to Russia because now we're in America's security architecture and America's a guarantor. No. Armenia has never said that the United States is Armenia's security partner, or that Armenia could rely on the United States for security. So what a lot of these so-called experts do is they create a straw man argument, right? And then they utilize that to discredit an argument that nobody ever made. So in that context, that's not what we have here. But to answer your question, the decoupling from Russia has been exceedingly beneficial for Armenia, because if we look at our weapons capabilities, the things that we're able to accrue, the things that we're able to purchase, the early warning systems conversations that we're able to have, this would not have been able to be a possibility if we remained under Russia's control or authoritarian belt. So with all the respect, those are rather nonsensical arguments that's simply not supported by any of the learned experts on the subject matter. But of course, I also have to be honest and say we do have experts that are very pro-West and did make claims that, we signed a strategic partnership, so all of our problems are resolved, right? Or, Trump, while he's angry at Zelensky, is going to come back and give Ukraine support after the Russians spurn him in the negotiating table. Therefore, we have nothing to worry about, and so on and so forth. You have basically two schools, right? One quite irrational, the other highly optimistic, but none of it is based on advanced empirical studies or dense knowledge of these things. Because again, these are led by public discourse and not scholarship. So kind of tying that into your second question, those who study polarity, those who understand shifts in power concentration and power dispersion, and this is a very important study that we have in international relations. When we look at the concentration power and dispersion of power at the macro level, at the polar level between superpowers, these allow us to understand how their behavior shapes the global security architecture. And so what we're having right now, as you kind of noted, but I'm going to speak in a little bit of technical terms, you had concentration of power in one hegemon, the United States, right? And they exercised complete hard power capabilities within the transatlantic structure. Now we're seeing a dispersion of power, where power isn't going to be fully concentrated in the United States, but rather it is basically being reformulated in Europe in a hard power capacity. So instead of having a singular source of hard power, now we're having two or multiple sources of hard power within the transatlantic alliance. This is why when people say the alliance is collapsing, that's just an ignorant statement. But be that as it may, how does this benefit Armenia? Well, the way Armenia has operated has been as followed. We have the United States as a hard power partner, but we have not been able to tap into its hard power capabilities yet. But the potential is there. And then we've had Europe, a soft power partner, who has done an immense job in providing layers of soft deterrence for us. Now, when this soft power partner becomes a hard power, your security environment, your diversification, your access to hard power capabilities has a multiplying effect. Because now it's not just France who's selling you weapons. It's not just Belgium who you're going to buy stuff from, right? It's not the Czechs that who you're having conversation with or the Dutch. You look at the entire European security architecture, right? With the exception of Hungary, okay? Every other European country is either pro-Armenia or leans Armenia. And what this means is that you now are having a hard power structure being formed that is overarchingly sympathetic towards the Armenians. And that in of itself gives Armenia access to tap into a pool of hard power resources that in the past didn't exist. So reducing this to a very simplified US is backing out, Europe is over, Russia's the winner, and all these sort of, infantile interpretations is not really how concentration and dispersion of power at the global and polar level operates. And so when we're talking about a Europe right now that is basically reestablishing its power capabilities, when you're looking at the Nordics, who Armenia has developed exceptional relationships with, right? When Denmark is taking the lead and saying, we have factories that have not produced weapons in decades, and we are now going to operationalize these, right? When we talk about the technical capabilities of these countries and the wealth that they have, right, we're now talking about a collective hard power architecture. And Armenia is situated exceptionally well to either be integrated in there or be a good partner with them, and more so have more access than the past. Because the European Union would tell us, listen, we don't sell weapons. That's not what we do, right? We're soft power. We could give non-lethal assistance, et cetera, et cetera. Or other European powers that we have bilateral relationships with, they will tell us, listen, we can help you, but let's try the EU avenue first, and then we'll build relations. But now that Europe starts thinking within the domain of geopolitics and hard power, it fully aligns with Armenia's ability to tap into it.
Wow, as always, Nerses, a very interesting, fascinating conversation, a lot to unpack. And we went from early warning systems to the Oval Office and then to Europe becoming a hard power. Thank you, as always.
Thank you very much for having me.